Hello, everybody. Hello. Hello, welcome to this evening's Royal Historical Society lecture. My name's Emma Griffin, I'm the President of the Royal Historical Society, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this evening's event with Caroline Dodds Pennock. Welcome everyone, to those of you joining us online as well, of course. Caroline is Senior Lecturer in International History at the University of Sheffield. She's trained in Aztec history at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and she's perhaps best known as the only British Aztec historian. Her first book, Bonds of Blood, Gender, Lifestyle and Sacrifice in Aztec Culture, actually won the Royal Historical Society's Gladstone Prize for 2008, and it looked at how human sacrifice could be a comprehensible part of everyday life and existence. Recently, she's widened her research focus to include exploring Indigenous histories across the Atlantic, bringing them into a global framework, as she will in fact do in tonight's lecture. On this topic, Caroline has recently published On Savage Shores, How Indigenous Americans Discovered Europe, which is now out in paperback. The book has been honoured as a New Statesman Best Book of the Year 2023, Smithsonian Magazine's 10 Best History Books of 2023, The Economist Books of the Year 2023, BBC History Magazine Books of the Year 2023, Waterstone History Books of the Year, and so on. You get the idea. It's a very wide... Congratulations, Caroline. Additionally, she was awarded the Voltaire Lecture Medal in 2023 from Humanists UK for her outstanding contribution to uncovering histories of early interactions between civilizations and broadening our comprehension of civilization. In addition to her work as a lecturer and author, Caroline has worked as a consultant and talking head expert for TV and radio, and appeared on programmes for broadcasters including the BBC, Channel 4, Sky, the Smithsonian Channel and Netflix. In tonight's lecture, Caroline will be speaking on the topic Cannibals, Curiosities or Catholics, Indigenous Peoples in early 17th century France. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hi, thank you for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to speak this evening. I don't know how I'm going to kind of live up to that, especially as I feel slightly nervous because I'm presenting some more specialist work that came out of the book for the first time. The paper does come out of work that I did for my book, which, as Emma said, came out last year. So the work comes out of some research I did for the book, and my main aim in the book was to transform the popular understanding of the early encounter between Europe and what we now call the Americas by writing Indigenous people back into our understanding of the period after 1492, flipping the script essentially on our understanding of encounter and showing the many thousands of Indigenous people, travellers, servants, enslaved people, diplomats, who were themselves discovering Europe in this period. Now, the book was almost finished. I was writing the book. I'd nearly finished, and my editor said, I think you need a bit more of a conclusion. So I started looking into a really fascinating group of Tupi travellers who voyaged from Brazil to France in 1613. And I found all these other Indigenous people that they crossed paths with in Paris. And so I started writing about them, and I wrote, and then I wrote a little bit more, and about 10,000 words later my editor said, I did not mean that much of a conclusion. And so we'll just go with the first version, she said. And so these amazing people quietly dropped out of the book. And this is the first time I've talked about them actually in a public forum, and I'm excited to share their stories, but I'm a bit nervous about it because, as some of you will know, I'm not actually a French historian. I think Emma made that very clear. And working across borders and across languages was one of the big challenges of this research project. I am constantly worried that an expert will tell me I'm getting something wrong. But the transnational nature of the project is really very much part of the point. One of the key things that I wanted to show is how common Indigenous peoples were across much of Europe by this point, how embedded they were in society, how active they were in forging their own links and legacies. And I'm going to talk about a particular French case study this evening, but obviously if people want to talk about those bigger themes in the questions afterwards, that's absolutely fine with me. The ubiquity of Indigenous peoples in Europe by the turn of the 17th century is borne out, I think, by the experiences of one young man, usually called Yapoko, who voyaged to France in 1604 with the traveller and apothecary Jean Moquet. Despite becoming most famous for this stereotypical image of cannibals at the bottom labelled Caribs, already by this point cannibal and carib are becoming inextricable, but actually he admired the skill and knowledge of the indigenous peoples that he met enormously and wrote an awful lot about it. And when he returned from the Amazon in 1604, 3 native boys took ship with him. One of them was Yapoko, a young prince of the Caribou people. He was too young to rule, and so his uncle was ruling until he came of age. The Caribou were the people we maybe know as the Yao. They were allies of the French and strong friends of honour, according to Moquet. The other 2 were a young man called Atupa and his elder brother, whose name we don't know. They were Kalina people that were then known as the Carib people. These are sworn enemies of the Caribou people, and so also of the French, who are really strongly favour the Caribou people. Now, we actually have an image of a tupa. Here he is. You can see him dancing. He's labelled here, a tupa at the bottom. And also Anakayori, top right, who travels to France as well. We'll hear a bit more about him later on. Exactly how these 3 young men ended up going to France is slightly obscure. The stories kind of get entangled in the different sources. Moquet admits that Yapoko was held as a hostage along with one of his brothers, but he also tells a convoluted story in which he was persuaded to take ship by yet another indigenous transatlantic traveller, someone they call an Indian son of the king of the island of Trinidad. He was serving as an interpreter for the French after being tricked away from his homeland by Walter Raleigh. Indigenous travellers really start to pop up everywhere in the accounts once you start looking for them. Now, Atupa and his elder brother seem to have probably come aboard voluntarily in the first instance. Moquet recounts how one day Atupa, who was then only 12 or 13 years old, had said that he was willing to come to France. But it seems that he might actually have thought that the ship itself was France, because when they set sail, Atupa threw himself off the ship, attempting to swim back to land. So after this, the French placed Atupa under guard, and they placed him under the guard of their ally, Yapoko, who dogged the footsteps of poor young Atupa as he paced up and down the ship, trying to work out how to escape. So we have here the ship lying at anchor in the river, and the poor child can literally see his homeland, but he can't get to his people because his old enemy, allied with his new enemies, is preventing his escape. Atupa despairs at his captivity and decides that he will drown himself or find another way to kill himself, but his elder brother holds him close. He watches him all the time, even at night, and tries to prevent his young brother from throwing himself to his death. One day, in a failed and desperate attempt to escape, Atupa stabs Yapoko, his captor, in the throat with a sharp piece of wood, flays the skin off the side of his neck. He's lucky to survive it, especially in this era. And in punishment, it was ordered by the French that Atupa be whipped. Now, this is a penance he bears without the slightest sound. Moquet says he seemed untouched by the punishment, despite many brutal blows. We can only imagine the helplessness of this young boy as he was thrashed with a stringed whip, much like a cat o' nine tails. And it's impossible for us to know how to read his silence. Was he crushed by despair? Was he determined not to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him suffering, as befitted a young Carib warrior? We just don't know. Moquet doesn't tell us, and seems entirely unmoved by the event. Like many Indigenous travellers, we also don't know his eventual fate or that of his brother, although Moquet says they were brought into France, and that's the last we hear of them. When Yapoko himself finally arrived in France, unsurprisingly, the reality doesn't live up to his expectations and the stories he's been told about it. He landed in the small coastal town of Cancale in Brittany, which is now famous for its intangible heritage as the oyster capital of France. And he was set to the monotonous, very menial task, and remember, he's a noble, he is the son of a ruler. He's set to this task of turning a spit over a fire. Unsurprisingly, Yapoko becomes bored and so entirely discontented that he abandons his post. He headed for Saint-Malo, perhaps hoping he could find a ship in this busy port, but was fetched back. There's a real line here and lots of questions in the sources about consent. We have some people who are labelled as enslaved and are quite clearly enslaved, but then there are many other people, like a lot of the people I'm going to talk about today, where you have to look out for words like brought or taken, or in this case, fetched back, which suggests an awful lot less consent than some other ways in which they're being presented. Moquet writes, this was in 1604 that he attempted to escape, and then we don't hear anything else about the fate of Yapoko until 1613, when the two men met again. Returned to Paris after travels through Africa, Syria, Palestine, Moquet was living in the Tuileries Palace as keeper of the king's cabinet of Curiosities, when he heard that a group of Tupinamba had arrived at court along with members of a 1612 expedition. Now, these men had gone to Brazil to found France Equinoctiale, equinoctial France. It's a reference to its location near the equator. It's in what is now northern Brazil. The French and the Tupinamba had been building alliances in Brazil for about a century by this point, forging reciprocal links that were strongly based on the idea of the Portuguese as a shared enemy. An earlier French attempt to found a colony in 1555 had collapsed in a fit of confessional infighting. It's actually an incredibly funny story where the Catholics and the Huguenots spend all their time arguing about the finer points of theology in the jungle instead of doing any actual colonizing, and so the whole thing just collapses. But by 1612, with the strongly Catholic Louis XIII on the throne and his devout mother Marie de Medici as regent, the expedition that was sent had a much stronger and more unified evangelical tone, and was led and most importantly funded, for the way a lot of our sources come out, by the Capuchins. Now, they were supported by other religious figures, but it's the Capuchin order and allies of theirs whose funding and efforts underlie this expedition. Now, when he entered the royal chamber, Moquet was surprised to spy Yapoko on the other side of it, who, according to Moquet, having recognised me, came suddenly up and caught me round the neck to embrace me, telling me his fortunes and how he is returned from Brazil. It seems that, like many young Indigenous men, Yapoko had crossed the Atlantic multiple times. I don't have time to tell his whole story now, but he has gone back and forth a number of times, whether in search of his home or just making the best of his skills, we don't know. But he has various adventures as the servant of a Breton colonist, including being captured by pirates off the English coast. And Yapoko has, at this time, eventually returned to France, this time to Poitou, where he had apparently been ordered to tell a woman called Madame de la Ravadière about what her husband, who was one of the expedition's leaders, had been getting up to. He'd been sent as a messenger. But while he was in Poitou, Yapoko, who was a young royal, remember, had again suffered another very severe affront to his dignity. He had been ordered to help the servants pull a pig out of the castle ditch. Now, he flatly refuses to be involved with this, and Madame de la Ravadière insults him, and so he promptly leaves, ending up in Paris via La Rochelle and Le Havre. He's travelling around France quite extensively. Exactly how Yapoko gets to Paris or why he goes there, we don't know, nor how he happens to be at court with the Tupinamba. Did he accompany them there as an interpreter or a go-between? Very Possibly. Did he fall in with men he knew from La Ravardier's crew? Maybe. We know that he's from the same region and has been to the same region that they've been colonizing. It could have been a coincidence. Whatever the explanation, Yopoko, who was by now an experienced traveller and translator, was at the French court in 1613 when a group of Tupinamba ambassadors from the region now known as Maranhão on the northern coast of modern-day Brazil presented themselves to Louis XIII. These Tupinamba men had arrived at court in the company of a Capuchin friar named Claude d'Abbeville. He is a missionary who'd formed part of the short-lived attempts to found equinoctial France. And concerned to secure further funding for his efforts, along with more missionaries and military support, he wrote an extended account of the Tupinamba's visit. Here it is. This is the frontispiece. And it has very unsubtle evangelical overtones, as does the frontispiece. According to d'Abbeville, the Capuchin, after being almost wrecked twice on the way from Brazil, within sight of the French coast, and of course saved by God from disaster, they were welcomed onto the shore by a civic procession that had bells, organs, singing of psalms. This is at Le Havre. And apparently in response to popular demand, the Tupinamba recited the Ave Maria and the Paternoster in Tupi. d'Abbeville saw this as evidence of their intense and voluntary conversion, a theme that he harps on quite a lot, as you can see exemplified by this rather unsubtle and obviously completely imagined image from his history of his time in Brazil. The quote at the top is from Isaiah. It says, "I will lift up my hand to the peoples, to the nations, behold my sign." Even assuming that the Tupi did conduct this pious performance that he says, though, reciting of well-known Christian doctrine in the Tupi language, there are actually much more subtle cultural nuances at work here than you might think from his text. d'Abbeville often wrote of the Tupinamba in paternalistic terms that made these grown warriors sound like children in his care. But there's every reason here to believe that these men were voluntary travellers, ambassadors of their nation, carefully managing French expectations and demands. For almost a century, the Tupinamba had been strategically engaging with the French through intermarriage, trade, and with intermediaries, using them as a buffer against the aggressive Portuguese, as well as a source of desirable metal tools, which made it much easier for them to make money from the French by cutting the Brazil wood, which is the main source of trade in the region, after the Europeans arrive. Coming from a world that had really complex and multifaceted forms of kinship, the Tupinamba were really familiar with the need to compromise and accommodate. And their performance of Catholic rituals, although it could have been evidence of genuine conversion, could equally have been an adaptation to French expectations, a willingness to enact appropriate behaviours in order to secure their allegiance with the French. Unlike the friars, the indigenous Brazilians did not see their beliefs as incompatible. They were quite capable of interpreting Catholicism in ways that made their systems of knowledge mutually comprehensible. We know a lot about how that happened in Brazil. So the group spend a few days recovering from their voyage and from nearly being shipwrecked at Le Havre, at the Abbey of Montevilliers, which is just outside the town. And they're guests there of the Abbess Louise de l'Hospital, who is a renowned Catholic reformer. The Capuchins are at the forefront of the Catholic Reformation in this period, and you can see throughout their desire to use the Tupinamba to promote their cause. It's not just in the text, it's in all these people who fund the expedition, who meet the Tupinamba, who host the Tupinamba. You see these connections over and over. The group then head for Paris via Rouen, picking up some 100 other Capuchin friars along the way. So the procession must have been a really impressive sight when it entered the city, following a cross, rejoicing and singing God's praises, according to d'Abbeville's account. At that time, the Tupinamba wore what was called their beautiful plumage, and they held maracas made from gourds, and Paris's elite thronged into the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of them. In fact, so many people crowded round the Capuchin church to hear them recite their prayers that they had to run away and hide at a neighbouring convent. Even when they were there, they were so overwhelmed by crowds trying to break down the door to see them that the king had to send armed guards to protect the doors of the convent to prevent people breaking in to try and see the tupi. D'Abbeville obviously credits this frenzy to the devotion of Parisians at seeing the conversion of what he called these poor Indian souls. But it seems much more likely they are the object of mass curiosity. Rumours about these magnificent strangers and this huge procession filtering through the city streets and drawing waves of the wildly curious. One thing that is clear, though, is that they are being deliberately put on display and fashioned at this moment as Indians. Because we know that the French poet François de Malherbe, in a letter to the astronomer and polymath Peiresc, wrote that when the Tupinambas passed through Rouen, they danced what he called a kind of wiggle without touching hands or budging from one place, and they were made to dress in the French style. But when they reached Paris, the Mercure François, which has often been called the first French journal, describes them dressed in their feathered clothes in their fashion. It obviously suited the Tupinambas or their French companions to frame themselves as more or less Europeanized depending on the context that they're in. And we see other indigenous groups doing this throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries. A lot of the diplomats who travel to the Spanish court do similar things. Now, they arrived in Paris on the 12th of April, 1613, and the very next day, d'Abbeville and various dignitaries accompanied the Tupinambas to the Louvre, which was a short walk from where they were staying. They paid homage to the king and queen and reportedly submitted their land and their persons to his sceptre. The idea of this voluntary submission, obviously, is in lots of sources about indigenous people. But there is a bit more, again, going on than simply an invention of a surrender. The senior ambassador, who was a man called Itapucu, who, again, we have a drawing of him from life. You'll find out later why he's billed Louis Marie. He gave a remarkable speech to the Dauphin, to Louis XIII, who is at that time around 12 years old, and to his mother, the Queen Regent Marie de Medici. And in this speech, which we have recorded in both French and in Tupi, he declared his gratitude to the Crown for sending men, in his words, to teach us the law of God and to defend us against our enemies. These two issues are inextricable in Itapucu's speech, and it makes it feel all the more plausible that the Tupinambas are there to seek French military support, which was essential to them to successfully hold off both their local enemies and the Portuguese allies of these local enemies. And they saw this as directly contingent and had been told as much on conversion to Christianity. These ideas of military support and Christianity come up again and again in the speech and are very clearly interwoven. Itapucu was about 38 years old, and he was a wily and self-assured diplomat. The son of a chief, all the reports say that he held himself confidently and seriously, and that he was an experienced orator who was apparently never weary when it comes to discussion, particularly of warfare and of points of our faith. Perhaps recognizing the diplomatic significance of conversion, Itapucu also seems to be trying to engineer the Christianization of his companions. D'Abbeville wrote, "We esteem him one of the best instruments we possess to help with the conversion of those like him." Indigenous peoples were perfectly capable of choosing to claim they had been converted and of understanding when it might be advantageous to do so. Among the crowds who witnessed the Tupinambas at court, remember, was the king's apothecary Moquet, and it's here that Yapoko reappears in our story. Barred from going in to see the Tupinambas, Moquet has spotted the Caribou noble, perhaps also loitering outside the royal chamber, and after a reunion in Moquet's lodgings, he takes Yapoko to see King Louis XIII. The young king apparently wanted to see this foreign prince, and he ordered Moquet to speak a little with him in his language, which apparently Moquet also knew. I do suspect that this linguistic play is for the curiosity of the king rather than really have anything to do with Yopoko's competence in French, because surely Yopoko by this point is an extremely experienced translator and go-between and must have known plenty of French. Whatever they discussed in front of the king, we don't know in the indigenous language, the king seems to have been sufficiently pleased to order that Yopoko be given some money. And the meeting between Yopoko and Louis I find fascinating because it's so unequal in the way it's described that it's easy to forget that it's a meeting of two young royals who are both kings in waiting with regents, relatives ruling in their stead. I do wonder a little bit whether Louis was able to recognize a fellow noble in Yopoko. He must have been introduced to him and who he was. It's not impossible, given the regularity with which indigenous elites are traveling to Europe to petition rulers by this point. But it seems quite unlikely in this case, given the abrupt turn in Yopoko's fortunes that followed. According to Moquet, he was taken to Le Havre, where Madame la Ravadière sent for him. And since then, I haven't heard any news. This is the last we hear of Yopoko, who it seems was probably an unwilling servant. How much power he had over his own fate is not entirely clear. Despite his noble birth, once he was isolated from his people and without a prominent patron like d'Abbeville, he was just one of the many indigenous people who laboured in homes and businesses across Western Europe after 1492, some putting down roots, others trying always to return home. Fascinatingly, Yopoko may not even have been the only indigenous man in the La Ravadière household, for Yves d'Evreux, who was a member of the Capuchin mission in 1613 as well, mentions in passing Pierre the dog, this is the quote, Pierre the dog, savage baptized in Dieppe. And he had some connection to the Lords of Ravadière and had lived with them, but then later returned to Brazil, to Maranhão. So there may have been more than one indigenous person living in this household. It's this ubiquity of indigenous people, how much they pop up and are present, that I find so interesting and important. Like so many indigenous people on both sides of the Atlantic during this period, the spectre of disease hung over the Brazilian travellers, and 3 of the Tupinambá were tragically struck down by an unknown ailment in the days after their triumphant visit to the Louvre. The first to die was an elder known as Carepira. It may be his age is why he's the first to succumb to his illness. This picture is drawn by the French engraver Léonard Gautier, and it's clearly stylized. All these images are stylized, but they were drawn from life. You can see his delicate tattoos on his body. I hope these are marks of his extensive military experience. Malherbe says that he was 80 years old, but if that's true, he's pretty well preserved. We do know he'd been a prisoner of war among the Tupinambá for 18 years, and so he'd become an honoured member of the tribe, adopted into the tribe. On the 22nd of April, soon after they arrived in Paris, he developed a high fever, catarrh, and inflammation of his lungs. According to d'Abbeville, at the height of his illness, with Itapucu sitting by his bedside, Carepira begged desperately to be baptized so that he would be saved. Recognizing how near he was to death, d'Abbeville baptized him Francois after one of the leaders of the expedition to Brazil. This is actually Carepira's 25th name, having received one for each of his valiant deeds. Sweating, he hallucinated great black birds eating his body like a rotting corpse and children pricking his body with knives. These hideous visions were only driven away by a kind woman who defended him and a white bird that came to carry him away to heaven. d'Abbeville obviously interprets these as visions of the Virgin Mary and of salvation, but this nightmarish jumble is really interesting from the point of view of an indigenous scholar because they could easily have come from the fevered imagination of a man who had entangled the partly understood threats and promises of Catholicism with his own people's beliefs. Birds in Tupi thought are often malign spirits causing disease and misfortune. Having been anointed with extreme unction and received the final sacrament, Carapira died on the 29th of April 1613 and was buried at the Capuchin convent in Paris. That very same day, Patua, which means chest, a likeable youth about 14 or 15, fell ill with a fever. And this caused great distress among his companions. Here he is, depicted in a classical pose, along with a compatriot who I'm going to get to in a minute. There's obviously a story here about the imagery of the Brazilians and how they were framed in Europe in terms of their visual depiction, appeal to French expectations, as well as the noble, savage myth, but I'm going to leave that aside for now and try and centre the actual indigenous people rather than the stereotypes and mythologies of the European imagination, though obviously those ideas are incredibly important to understanding these sources. And in writing about this, I kind of would disentangle this a lot more, but we'd be here literally all day if I tried to do that now. So I'm going to set that aside for now. Again, these images are drawn from life, though, and they do reflect differences which are described in the sources. They're contemporary to the original d'Abbeville publication. Again, showing how important the Tupi were to the Capuchins' evangelical mission, Patua was visited during his illness by the Capuchin Bishop of Grasse, who placed his own golden cross around the young man's neck, which he apparently clutched onto as a talisman. Like Carapira, Patua apparently hallucinated and begged to be baptized. As the boy was drawing near death, again d'Abbeville relented, baptizing him Jacques after the Archbishop of Sens, a faithful courtier who had strong connections to the Pope as well as to the king. He's very carefully building these connections, not just in his writing, but in these baptisms. Also baptized that day was Manet, who was called a sweet, docile, and patient man with a likeable demeanour that was credited with his quiet endurance of his illness by the Europeans, although it seems also very likely to have been related to his stoic Tupinamba upbringing. Like the others, Manet experienced burning fever and bitter pain as well as paralysis towards the end. After accepting extreme unction, Patua and Manet both passed away on Monday the 6th of May, and they were buried close to Carapira, honourably dressed in the Franciscan habit. d'Abbeville saw these three happy souls in his mind as the beginnings of the troop which we hope to line up under the leadership of the Holy Cross, their blood fatal to the devil, and their glory a deposit for the conversion of the homeland. The Tupinamba was seen as the vanguard of an army of indigenous souls who would march into heaven, saved by the friars and their allies. And you see this epitomised in what happens next, which is a triumphal baptism of the three surviving Brazilians at the Church of the Capuchin Fathers on the 24th of June, which is appropriately enough the feast of John the Baptist. This is surely not a coincidence. Along with the distinguished Itapucu were two younger men, Guaraju and Japui. All three were drawn by Gautier in their baptismal finery. Where do I point this? Where is the computer that is picking this up? Ah, there we go. There's Guaraju and Japui, and they're in their baptismal robes, long belted silk, buttoned robes of white taffeta, and holding three lilies, which neatly symbolise both the Holy Trinity and the fleur-de-lis of the French monarchy. The church must have been an incredible sight for the Tupinamba as well as for everybody else. It was covered entirely with silk tapestries woven with gold, canopied with rich cloth, and the entire sanctuary was carpeted with silk for the occasion. The Queen Regent and the King arrived at about 4 p.m, and so as not to keep them waiting, the three Tupinamba hurriedly processed into the church, each led by two Capuchins clad in white. d'Abbeville translated the service which took place in Tupi for the presiding Bishop of Paris, as well as for the royal godparents who witnessed the initiates, professing their faith in Tupi. When the time came for the three men to receive their baptismal names, the Queen Regent wanted to call the men Henri, Louis, and Jean, after her late husband, her son, and John the Baptist, whose saint's day it was, of course. But the bishops suggested that all three carry the name of the king, who was their godfather. So to the king's great pleasure, and presumably everybody else's confusion, they were all named Louis. Now, this does presumably cause some confusion because later at their confirmation, they're given second names. So Itapucu was dubbed Louis-Marie, Guaraju was named Louis-Henri, and Japui became Louis Saint-Jean or Jehan. It's sometimes passed. There's a heavy evangelical veneer, of course, on all the accounts of these events, but even in these idealized accounts, we can find hints at indigenous agency and choices. So d'Abbeville breathlessly records the baptism, declaiming, "It is in these baptismal waters that these cannibalistic and man-eating animals, killed by paganism, recovered their life with grace." But much more interesting to me than this very well-studied Catholic framing is the way in which Itapucu, again apparently spying an opportunity for political gain, humbly offered his thanks to the king and queen and begged they would show his compatriots at home the same favour. The Queen Regent, apparently overwhelmed with piety, promised him all assistance possible, and the regents fell to their knees in thanks before the new Christians processed from the church, holding bouquets of lilies. This really fascinates me because it is so similar to what happens in 1493 when Columbus brings Taino people to Spain. The echoes are incredibly similar. The three men all get very sick at this point, but they do recover. And there'd been rumours for weeks by this point that the Capuchins were trying to find appropriately Christian wives for the Tupinambá men. Malherbe gossiped in his letters that there were already some women ready for them. "I believe we are only waiting for their baptism to accomplish these marriages and ally France with the Isle of Maragna." Intermarriage was a deliberate strategy that had been used by both the French and the Tupi in Brazil for a century, and we know that the Tupinambá were consciously engaging in this and practicing it because we see cases in Brazil of them insisting on French wives to cement their alliances, even sometimes very ostentatiously agreeing to renounce polygamy to secure these brides and secure the allies. I'm fascinated as well by how widespread knowledge of the Tupinambá visitors had become in France by this point. They were gossiped about in Malherbe's letters, apparently inspired a famous lutenist to compose a saraband in their honour, and they appeared in prints and pamphlets. More evidence of the Capuchin campaign to win over public opinion and secure crown support is preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. This anonymous coloured print, but I couldn't get a coloured version of it, shows the three Tupinambá kneeling before the bishop to be baptised. Here they are in the middle. No, this doesn't work. Here they are in the middle. And they're, again, holding lilies and wearing pointed hats encircled with flowers, which, as far as I know, they did not, in fact, wear at the time. They're flanked by the imposing figure of the Queen Regent over here on the left, who looks so much like images of Queen Elizabeth. It's very, very stylized, really interesting. And then also, of course, the boy king, Louis, on the right. And then we have Capuchin friars, members of the public around. The picture is captioned underneath: "The baptism of three savages or Tupinambú who were baptized in the Church of Capuchins by Monsieur Levesque of Paris and named by the King Louis XIII the day Saint John Baptist 1613. Underneath there are three amusing verses and then a pious recitation of events, again with heavy emphasis on the Capuchins' evangelical work. A note at the bottom informs us that the pamphlet was being sold by Michel de Bathonnière in Paris that same year on Rue Montorgueil at the sign of the Deer's Horn, just north of the Louvre. There are two other engravings in the same file, apparently drawn at the order of the Queen, and they show the Tupinamba dancing. They're deliberately positioned in these images between the two worlds, Christian and familiar from the neck down, but exoticized and othered by their faces and feathers, as well as by their gourd maracas, which the Europeans would have seen entirely as musical instruments, but carried a very different meaning to the Tupi. They were blessed before use, always with breath and smoke to give them spiritual power in performance. So what the Tupi thought was happening when they were dancing in an evangelical context in Europe was presumably very different to what the Christians watching thought was happening. Along with accounts by d'Abbeville, which was published in 1614, so very, very quickly, and then another by d'Evreux, another Capuchin the year later, this flood of popular prints would have ensured it wasn't just the elite who were gossiping about these fascinating visitors. They become part of the currency of Parisian streets. They're caricatured in pamphlets, imagined in verse, and gawked at, as we know, when they passed. There's also an astonishingly vibrant fresco copying Ferenz engravings, these at the Château de Montbras in Lorraine, which had just been recently built, and then apparently decided to make a copy of this exotic image. And by a fascinating coincidence, the Tupinamba also gave their name to a new tuber which was introduced from Algonquian territory by Samuel de Champlain. The tupinambour, or as we know it, the Jerusalem artichoke, was widely eaten in France by 1613, and the presence of the tupinamba in the popular imagination of the Americas somehow seems to have been so prominent that this sunflower root, which was never eaten in Brazil and had nothing to do with them, became entangled with their presence in the popular imagination. One of the things that I kind of most want to emphasize is that although this group was certainly unusual and unusually well recorded, as you can tell, they were just a few of the most high-profile examples of the indigenous travellers who were becoming ubiquitous in France and in other parts of Europe by this time. Even if we only look at people from Brazil, the connections to the Brazilwood trade meant that areas, especially of northern France, places like Normandy, saw a large number of visitors, including, for example, the 50 Tupi who helped mock up an entire Brazilian village on the shores of the Seine in 1550. This is a whole other story, but it is a great story. You can see them on the left here and in the foreground. And then as well, also in Rouen, the three people who inspired Michel de Montaigne's famous essay on the Cannibals. He said he met them in Rouen in the 1550s. You also have large numbers of little references in archives to individuals who are being baptized or married. At the same time as the Tupinamba ambassadors were negotiating royal diplomacy, we even have for example, an enslaved Tupi child of around 12 years old, Pirawao, was also waiting to be baptized at the same time as them in the household of Madame de Souvray, who was the mother of the recently appointed Marshal of France. He was in his 70s, so she was probably a best part of 90. This child was baptized as another Louis by d'Abbeville himself on the 15th of September and was confirmed 8 days later by the Bishop of Rennes, where and at that time his hostess, or perhaps we should call him his owner, gave him a male version of her own name, Francois. And so here we have an enslaved indigenous boy who became Louis Francois, and while enslaved in this household, became godchild to one of the most powerful families in France. The last we hear of him, he is now in the service of the king. It's easy to imagine he could have proved an attractive ornament to the boy king who was just coming of age. On the 7th of February, 1614, the three Tupinamba converts took their leave of the king before departing for Brazil. According to Malherbe, the greatest orator among them, who must be Itapucu, offered their farewells, and the king presented them each with a gold cross with a golden fleur-de-lis at each corner. Reportedly, the favours that the king had lavished on the three men, including their baptisms, marriages, gifts, clothes making them gentlemen, had cost more than 10,000 cruzados, which is a huge sum of money. Many historical accounts, secondary accounts, claim that they disappear at this point. But actually, when the Portuguese official Diogo de Campos Moreno went to São Luís at the end of 1614 to negotiate the surrender of the short-lived French outpost that was there, he saw two of the travellers among the local leaders there. They were dressed fabulously in crimson velvet, trimmed with fine gold, wearing beaver hats with white feathers, and they were accompanied by their equally richly dressed white French wives. One of the three had died since returning home, but the remaining two are clearly continuing to milk their status as favoured princes among the Tupinambá. I do wonder whether if they weren't at the fort, they took off all this velvet and so on. It must have been incredibly hot to wear all of that in Brazil. So you wonder whether this is a performance for the Portuguese at the fort and for the French at the fort. Were they going back and returning to their traditional ways of living? Or maybe their marriages keep them tied to the French and to the Christian community. We just don't know. We also don't know whether their Catholicism was faith, and there are plenty of accounts of people who do appear to have been truly converted in this period, whether it was a facade, whether it was half-hearted, whether it was convenience or just a fiction in their eyes or the eyes of the Capuchins. The reality is that it's probably some combination of all of these among the men. The prominence of these men among a group of visiting leaders certainly suggests they have joined the go-betweens, what are called Tupinambá, who we know were so vital to both sides in this encounter, in this period. But we can't know the truth of their minds or hearts because, like so many Indigenous travellers, we have no records that tell us their thoughts, their perspectives, only their voices as supposedly recorded by Europeans. After 1615, when Marie de Medici successfully negotiated what are often called the Spanish marriages, the French rivalry with the Portuguese in Brazil is quickly quashed. So we don't really get to know what happens as a result of Itapucu's diplomatic endeavours. The settlement is abandoned, and its existence seems to have been expunged from the French imagination. They want almost people to believe that they never were enemies of their Spanish, because at that time the Spanish and Portuguese crowns are unified. They never were enemies. They've always been allies. And so there's very little information about this period, about this settlement. It's been really fascinating to see how little it even appears in more recent histories of this period, despite the fact that this settlement formed the climax of a century of careful negotiations, intermarriages, and allegiances based on mutual benefit, mutual opposition to the Portuguese. The Capuchins, interestingly, don't seem to have had very many qualms about allowing the Portuguese, their Catholic brethren, to take over the enterprise of conversion. They hand over their chapel, monastery, and school to the Franciscans. But 1615 marks the end of French imperial ambitions in Brazil, and they direct their attention further north to what is now French Guiana, abandoning their Tupinambá allies to the predations of Portuguese slave traders. And then the slave trade ramps up enormously from this point onwards. Like so many Indigenous travellers, Caripira, Patui, and Mane, as we know, never made it home. The convent where they were buried lay at what is now the corner of the Rue de Castiglione, which is just across from the Tuileries Gardens. Why has it there? Sorry. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on. Sorry. I wanted to get a better picture of the Rue de Castiglione and where the convent would have been, but it was all shut down because of the Olympics when I was there recently, so I had to do a very close-up picture. It's just across from the Tuileries. Anyway, it was demolished. The convent and the church and its grounds were demolished in 1804, and all of the remains buried at the Capuchin cemetery, were transferred to the Parisian catacombs, the entrance of which is on the left here. Somewhere in this underground labyrinth, their bones lie among the jumbled remains of centuries. I'm not showing the human remains, but those of you that haven't seen the interior, essentially they've taken skulls and embedded them in the walls, thigh bones all together, arm bones together. So the remains of these Tupinamba lie in foreign soil. Their families and descendants denied the possibility of mourning, of letting go, of traditionally grieving their loved ones, and of performing the proper ceremonies that would ensure their spirits passed safely into the afterlife. One of the few accounts we have of what they believed about this says that they believed they would go off behind the high mountains where they dance in beautiful gardens with the souls of their forebears. For Indigenous peoples whose beliefs tie the corporeal really closely to the spiritual, as well as people to their land, this loss would have been, and still is in many cases, deeply felt. The remains of thousands of Indigenous travellers still lie buried in Europe, some of them not very far from where we are now. In churchyards and cemeteries, under fields and homes, and in catacombs, they lie, often unmarked, among the jumbled vestiges of centuries. Their ongoing presence in French soil speaks to the long history of Indigenous travellers to Europe, travellers who are too often erased or overlooked in telling these histories, especially the popular histories of this period, and of colonisation, of empire, and of globalisation. Now, I'm not claiming to be the first person to point out the realities of Europe's cosmopolitan past. Scholars, activists, descendant communities have all shown very clearly the ubiquity of peoples of colour and of Indigenous peoples in Europe, in the case of Indigenous people from as early as 1493. Yet few of the tourists walking past the Tuileries know about the Indigenous travellers who set foot there, and few historians think to write them into the history of early French colonisation, usually confining discussion of Indigenous go-betweens to their own shores and seeing any Indigenous travellers here mainly in the category of curiosities. But I'm glad to say that is changing. My work and that of colleagues and knowledge keepers is in part a project of recovery. We are filling a gap in popular and sometimes academic knowledge by bringing to light the neglected stories of native travellers and ideas. But it's more than that, I think, by recognising Indigenous mobilities, writing an Indigenous-centred history of early modern Europe. It's my hope we can shift popular understandings of this period, destabilise modern assumptions about the whiteness of the European past, and redraw the Atlantic as a place of Indigenous activity, imagination, and power. Thank you very much for listening. I am sorry that I apparently don't understand PowerPoints, but I don't know where I'm supposed to point it.
Caroline, thank you. Absolutely brilliant paper. And we've got obviously an opportunity for questions. So please, right, there we go. Let's get started.
Okay. I thought what you said about the selective embrace of Christianity was really interesting. So if we buy into this very politically savvy idea that they would basically amp up their Christianity for the political relationship with the French, how much did that affect, in your opinion, the national identity of the Tukanumbu, if I'm pronouncing that right, sorry if I butchered it, people? Thank you.
So that's an interesting question because I'm not sure that the Tupinamba have a national identity. They have lots and lots of local identities, and they're often kind of lumped together in the popular imagination. We call them the Tupinamba, but they would have known themselves by these much smaller communities. And honestly, I don't think it affects their identity that much as long as they're living within their communities. Now, the sources for this are quite weak. I have much better sources for what happens in Spanish America, where these communities become literate much faster, are integrated much faster than in Portuguese communities. But what we tend to see is that where Indigenous peoples continue to live in their own communities, they're much more able to code switch, to utilise Christian ideas when it suits them. So we literally see them, as I mentioned in the paper, saying, polygamy is the right way to do things, this is all nonsense, but okay, in order to cement this alliance, I'll just have one wife, fine, all right. Though we also see lots of Portuguese going the other way and becoming so embedded among indigenous communities, and men usually having lots of wives, that the Catholic friars are really angry about it because it's too much accommodation. When they tend to lose their language and identity is when Europeans do their best to wipe it out, not to put too fine a point on it. So the Spanish have a policy of reduction, where you uproot indigenous peoples and you put them into Catholic communities, where they then are required to speak in Spanish, to learn, to dress a certain way, to act a certain way, to profess Catholicism. The Portuguese, it's much more forms of forced labour, where you uproot people either as enslaved people or as forced labour, but in doing so you take them away from their homelands, from their communities, and then they're required to pray a certain number of times a day. They can only be monogamous. They have to conform in terms of dress and so on to European standards. So for me, I think it's much more to do with uprooting from community than it probably is to do with the profession of Catholicism.
Caroline, thank you. That was terrific. I know that you said that you don't know very much about what happened to the ambassadors on their return in this case. I'm particularly interested if you have come across anything in the Spanish-speaking world about how people were received by their communities on return, and whether their travel experience was seen as immensely useful and cementing alliances and all of that, or something to be slightly suspicious and wary of?
So it's a big, it's a very small question if I only talk about the Tupinambá, where we know almost nothing about what communities felt about the return of these people, except that it seems that people do return and reintegrate. It's a much bigger question if we talk about indigenous peoples more generally, because we have huge amounts of information and it varies depending on when and where you're talking about. But from very early on, it does seem that most indigenous communities felt that it was useful to have people who had seen Europe, who knew what they were dealing with. There are lots of occasions right from the very beginning in the Caribbean islands of rulers sending people as ambassadors to find out what these people are up to, essentially, and what it's like. And so these are diplomats, really deliberate diplomats. The Spanish world, by this point, has a back and forth of ambassadors all the time, because the indigenous nobility quite quickly convert to Catholicism, whether genuinely or strategically, we don't know, but they make a big thing of how they have converted in order to maintain their position in the colonial world and to maintain status above the Masoalas, the ordinary people. So we do know that people tend to want to return home, which once you get into a cycle where there must have been lots of people returning home suggests you aren't treated with any kind of hostility. So the Spanish crown, who have different laws about indigenous enslavement to the Portuguese, the Spanish crown will pay the return voyage of any indigenous person who wants to go back to the Americas, and we know that lots and lots and lots of people take up that offer. They appeal for their freedom successfully and then go home. And they disappear into their communities so successfully that we have no trace of them. So there's not a lot of, I shouldn't carry on talking because no other people have questions, but we have, for example, amazing Nahua poetry from central Mexico about voyaging and about how it's becoming blended into the indigenous imagination. It's just much better recorded there than it is in the Portuguese world in this early period. I can't think of an example of people being regarded suspiciously, although I suspect, purely speculatively, that if these particular Tupinambá men were seen to have allied themselves exclusively with the French as opposed to standing in that middle ground, then they would have been treated in a very different way. That's not in line with Tupi ways of kinship.
Thank you very much for the paper. I've got two questions which are both really about gender and the place of women within the stories that you've been presenting. Firstly, you sort of touched a little bit on how European men are engaging with Tupi women in Brazil, but is there a Tupi equivalent of Pocahontas? Are any of these French men bringing Tupi partners, wives, back to France? And the other thing that I found quite interesting was you mentioned that the Tupi converts are being presented with French wives, but you didn't tell us anything about these women. And I wondered what their background is and what their level of consent to these relationships was.
I wonder too. I don't know anything about the women who are the wives, I'm afraid. I really wish I did. Don't know anything about them. Though we do know of other cases where French women are very reluctant to be married off to Tupinamba men. It's not seen as a very desirable thing to be sent off into the jungle to marry a stranger. So there are cases of them having difficulties finding possible wives. But these particular women we don't know anything about. There is one very famous example of an equivalent to someone like Matoaka, Pocahontas as she's best known, and that is a woman called Guaibimpara, who is often called Catherine of Brazil. Now, in the early 1500s, a Portuguese man who became famous under the name Caramuru, he is shipwrecked on the Brazilian coast. And he manages, lots of the other men seem to have been killed, but he manages to become part of the community and is married very problematically to the extremely young daughter of a ruler. Now, that woman, who has obviously no consent at the beginning because she is extraordinarily young, becomes known as Catherine of Brazil. She comes, it seems that later on, she becomes a really strategic, he becomes a kind of diplomatic figure, an important figure in Brazil. He also marries some other women, but it's only her that is ever talked about in the sources. And Caramuru and Guaibimpara are often framed in this idealized way in Brazilian histories as the mother and father of Brazil, this Adam and Eve kind of story, as if Brazil, which is what they want you to believe, has this idealized, perfect, blended historical culture rather than this long history of racism against indigenous and also black communities. They've created this idealized, blended nation in the mythology. Anyway, much more interesting from my point of view is that she is a real woman who comes to Europe and is in São Malo and is baptized in São Malo, where she becomes the goddaughter of a woman called Catherine de Grange, who also is the wife of a man who brings some people from what is now New France in Canada, what is now Canada, what is New France. So you have these communities of kind of transatlantic communities of knowledge. That's a sidebar. The mythologies say that she met Catherine de Medici. She didn't, but there is a very famous 18th century poem that says she did. What she does do, though, is go back to Brazil, and there's actually quite good records that after her husband dies, she becomes this matriarch with lots of children controlling her own property, and she has a revelation, she says, of Christianity, and she founds the first Christian sanctuary. And there's still a monastery on the site that she founded, and she's sanctified in Brazil. So you do have some equivalents. There aren't very many, because most of these French men marry Brazilian women and then leave them in Brazil, or they couple with Brazilian women and leave them in Brazil. But yeah, you do have occasional examples. She's the most famous.
Only if there aren't any other questions. Very fascinating talk. Well, I'm interested in baptism, and you showed a picture of the three indigenous people being baptised. But when Gibbon goes to Italy, he notices all these medieval baptistries, which are still sort of, some of them functioning, which were obviously designed for adult baptism, for, I suppose, for slaves and Jews and so on. Is there any evidence of what happened to them in the water sort of department? Were they sprinkled, or were they covered with more water, or even immersed?
It's not actually mentioned, but contextually almost certainly sprinkled, because they turn up in these enormous silk outfits and also depart in enormous, impressive silk outfits. And it's taking place in a church with a medieval font rather than... Not as far as I know. That doesn't mean they couldn't have been. A lot of these things are imagined, and we're dependent on reading these small details and reading against the grain, but there's no evidence of immersion that I know of. Sorry, the answer to lots of these questions is we don't know.
Is there any evidence of travelling vice versa between South America and Western Africa, and travellers travelling upwards? Aztec, sort of people of Aztec or different communities. Have you come across any documentation or any research?
Yeah, we have occasional accounts of travellers who have crossed the Atlantic to Western Africa. Yes, there are very strongly established links with Western Africa because of the transatlantic slave trade, of course. You look like you have... Sorry, I didn't... Oh no, not that I know of before 1492, no. There are a handful of sources that suggest that people from North America might have come across kind of Greenland way to places in northern Scotland or Iceland or these kinds of places. There's a medieval account of some men who were in a boat that were apparently washed across the Atlantic, and they could have been, but were not necessarily Native American. They seem to have tattoos described that are quite typical of Inuit tattooing. But there's no, other than the Vikings who went to Canada, there's no confirmed contact pre-1492.
Thanks for your lecture. It was absolutely brilliant. My question is with regards to religion as a tool. For my instance, when the British first came and the Muslims first came to my community, they agreed with our fundamental principles, and it's only later on that they said, well, this is not really Christianity, you need to make these changes. Do you see similar things in South America, or was the balance of power the other way around? It was just the French and the indigenous communities were just following that and trying to align with the French, or were the French bending and twisting Christianity to be more accommodative to give them a headway into these communities?
Yeah, you absolutely see accommodations, because there are very small numbers of French and very large numbers of indigenous people. And so in order to make any headway, and also in order to translate concepts across languages, they often give way on certain technical aspects. I mean, imagine trying to translate the idea of the Holy Trinity. People don't understand what that means when you explain it in the same language, let alone often across languages. It's something that the Catholics argue about throughout, and the Pope has to declare on repeatedly throughout the 16th century, because the friars in Mexico and in Spanish America want to translate Christianity into indigenous languages. And at the beginning, that's seen as a good thing to do. You know, you communicate with the indigenous communities. And then they realize that what's happening is that concepts are suffering from slippage. Sometimes deliberately, where they've been prepared to compromise on the concepts, and sometimes accidentally. And so the Pope, who is obviously influential for the Capuchins as well, is pronouncing on these issues quite regularly. We know that sort of accommodation is happening, because I mentioned we have Itapuku's speech in both Tupi and in French. And what you see in the Tupi version, which was translated by some amazing colleagues recently, retranslated from the historic Tupi, is that it seems that the indigenous ways of thinking about gods are becoming polarized, so that they still retain, even though he says he's a Christian, they still retain the indigenous words, the indigenous beliefs, but it's becoming slightly more binarized. So things that were associated with dark and with night are becoming associated with the devil, where gods that were associated with nature and with the light are becoming God. Does that make sense? And that's clearly coming from the ways that it's being taught. You don't see many friars who are prepared to say, even if they did, well, this is an important thing and that's not so important to us. But we know in practice they were prepared to give ground and to accommodate from the fact that there are lots of go-betweens who have multiple wives because they've gone to live within indigenous communities, for example. So clearly monogamy is somewhere they're prepared to give ground if necessary. So.
Hiya, thank you so much for that. I've been reading recently about how indigenous ideas kind of got integrated into European thinking through thinkers like Kondiaronk, through like Lahontan's dialogues. And I was just wondering if throughout your research you'd found any evidence of that kind of indigenous thinking becoming integrated into European thinking through these travellers?
It's really difficult because tracing ideas is so hard, especially in periods before. So the Candiaronk dialogues are 18th century, much higher indigenous literacy, much higher recording rates. And so it's difficult to track the spread of ideas. What we do know is that indigenous people are influencing behaviours, practices, and therefore presumably also ideas much earlier than people think they are. So the traditional story that is told about the consumption of chocolate, for example, is that missionaries and conquistadors bring it from the Americas, and that it is accommodated to European tastes and is transformed into a Europeanized thing so as not to be an indigenous practice. There are two things that are wrong with this story. One, the work of Marcy Norton has shown very clearly that what actually happens is that indigenous ways of consumption, including frothing and tastes, are imported, and then simply they make tweaks to allow for the things that we would have had in Europe at that time that were not, that they didn't have. So they put black pepper in instead of chili, for example, because they don't have that. The second is that the first people to prepare drinking chocolate in Europe were Maya lords in 1540, it's an amazing story about this group of Maya lords, Don Juan Apot is the first converted Quechua Catholic. He voluntarily converts to save his people, and he comes to Europe and shows the splendours of his land. And one of the things they bring is drinking chocolate. Smoking is an indigenous practice that is introduced by indigenous people. If you believe the large stories about it, Walter Raleigh brings tobacco and potatoes to England, but people are smoking in the streets of Seville decades before Raleigh ever thinks of going to the Americas. That is an indigenous practice that has indigenous ceremony around it, which is replicated by Europeans. We see how it's incorporated into feasting, how it's incorporated into social mores. Now, I know you asked about ideas. And you do see enormous amounts of interchange that are better recorded in the Spanish Americas, and where indigenous knowledge around technologies, around science, so indigenous science, knowledge of plant-based medicines, the Aztecs, unsurprisingly, because they dissect people on a regular basis, are incredible surgeons. They can conduct an abortion on a woman who is going to die in a way that Europeans in this period can't even dream of. They learn enormous amounts from indigenous people, and scientific knowledge is, again, seen as being Europeanized, but the more we look at it, the more we realize it's indigenous people who are bringing that knowledge, who are responsible for incorporating that knowledge. So you can track some of it. Ideas like philosophy, it's much harder. You do see interchanges. Jean Deléry records fascinating discussions between indigenous and European people, where the indigenous people say, so you're taking all this wood to Europe. Why is that? Don't you have wood? And they say, no, we do have wood, but this is better wood. Okay, so why are you taking so much of it? Well, we need to make money. And they say, what do you need money for? Are you poor? And no, we need it for our children. He says, well, why do you need money for your children? Won't they be able to? And of course, Léry is using it to make a comment on European luxury. And so it could be invented, the same as Michel de Montaigne, who uses Cannibals to critique Europeans. But nonetheless, you have a genuine engagement with, albeit perhaps a stylized indigenous ways of doing things in order to critique European ways of doing and thinking. I'm still doing the thing where you say, we don't know. But there are so many more connections and so much more intellectual interest even early on that it is inconceivable there isn't intellectual exchange, but it's very hard to track a lot of it.
Yeah, can you elaborate? You mentioned that there was a lot of intermarriage. I mean, not a lot, but there's some instances of intermarriage between the French and the people in Brazil. The same happened in Quebec, in North America.
Absolutely.
And now, for example, Mexico is 90% a mixed country. And Hernan Cortés, when he arrived in Mexico, actually he encouraged intermarriage, actually to colonize the country. Can you elaborate on whether the colonial powers at the time, whether England, the Dutch, the Spaniards, the French, had a different view on intermarriage? Thank you.
Yeah, they have very different views, actually. So the Spanish, to start with, encourage intermarriage for colonization, as you say. You then get later on the introduction of the casta system, the caste system where people are categorized by how white they are, essentially, and the whiter you are, the better. But it is very different to the idea of one drop of blood tainting your blood, because they have very specific categories. So being 3/4 white, you get a specific name. It means you're much better, whiter than someone who is half black and 1/4 indigenous and So it's very different to the idea that emerges in the British Caribbean, where a single drop of black blood makes you black. It is a very, very different, much more graded kind of system. But prior to the late 1600s, actually there is a reasonable amount of encouraging of intermarriage, including between African and African descended and indigenous peoples. And also between, even in some cases, it's accepted African peoples and Hispanic descended peoples. So there's a lot of intermarriage. The British, on the other hand, almost entirely prohibit the intermarriage or even sexual contact. Of course it happens. It especially happens in cases of sexual violence. There's an enormous amount of sexual violence against indigenous women in the British colonies. But technically, it's very, very rare to be permitted, and only in cases of Christianized women. So Matoaka Amanute, better known as Pocahontas, is one of the very rare cases of intermarriage, actually. The Portuguese permit it, even encourage it, but also enslave large numbers of people. The French sit somewhere in the middle. So in the South American territories early on, they seem to permit it, and then in the later French territories, where they're more influenced by the British, they prohibit it. The Dutch, who are in the Americas but more in East Asia, the Dutch actually incentivize marrying local women, but you're not allowed to come back once you have done it. It's a way of forcing you to stay in the colonies to build up the population. So yeah, they have very different attitudes to it, yeah.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for one or two more questions, if anybody's got...
Hi. So you were saying before about how the French eventually gave up Brazil and then moved over to Guyana. Is that because of pressures from the Spanish and the Portuguese, or is it more of a case like with Britain and India, it just wasn't worth the effort of putting in more resources to try and keep the actual stronghold?
No, it's because of the Spanish marriages. So Marie de Medici negotiates that. Now, I wrote this down because it's not my specialist, and I wrote down exactly who it is now. Louis XIII gets married to Anne of Austria, who is the daughter of King Philip III, who is both Spanish and Portuguese king at that time. The thrones had been unified, and Princess Elizabeth is married to the heir to the Spanish throne. And so they then have to stop fighting with the Portuguese and give up the territory. So they peacefully hand over that little outpost, which has only been there in its form for a relatively few years, and move further north so as not to be competing with the Portuguese. It literally just sort of cuts off. It's crazy, after a century of back and forth, that just puts an end to it. And they can never recover that territory even after they start fighting again.
Thank you so much. It's been fascinating. Have you looked at the Tupinamba visits to the Dutch, the slightly later ones? Do you bring that in at all? Or?
No, is the short answer.
No.
So the book went up to the founding of Jamestown, and this is actually slightly after that. I mean, when you do a project, you have to have a cut-off date. And so my cut-off date arbitrarily was the founding of Jamestown. Not arbitrarily. It was because it was a period that was neglected. The ambassadors to the British after that point start to be better known, better recognised. And also the 16th century is a moment of greater flux when you feel that Indigenous travellers have a little bit more power, a little bit more leverage than starts to happen later on. And so this is kind of as far forward as I've gone. I have obviously read a little bit about later stuff and people's work on the later travellers, but no, I haven't done the Dutch stuff, I'm afraid. Sorry. I'm sure it's fascinating. Well, there were really a lot of languages and places already, and the Dutch didn't quite make it in.
Anybody else? Are you putting your hand up there? No. No. Someone's trying to get my attention. In that case, I think it's probably time for us to draw things to a close. Caroline, that was a really, really fantastic paper, and naturally I want to ask a question about what is the difference between the kind of the different European colonisers, and I think what you've really got us to do is actually switch it round and think much more about the Indigenous experience. And I think that's a really, really novel interpretation and something we've all really, really enjoyed listening to tonight. So I'm sure the audience will want to join me in thanking Caroline. Before we go, I'll just make a few announcements for other RHS events that are coming up. On Wednesday, the 23rd of October, we've got an online event on histories of the political left. Our next in-person lecture will be at Gresham, our kind of annual public history lecture, and we've got Janina Ramirez talking about writing women into history, that you'll also be able to see online if you can't make it to London. And then we'll be back in here in Mary Ward House in November, 22nd of November, for the inaugural lecture of the incoming president, Lucy Noakes, here at 6 p.m. So I look forward to seeing people back at an RHS event soon. Thanks very much indeed, Caroline. And there's tea and coffee if anybody wants it.